Officially, Human Rights Day in South Africa is a day that has seen much contention around its name, with some believing that it should be called Sharpeville Day as a way to pay homage to the 69 people that lost their lives in the Sharpeville Massacre on the 21st of March 1960. But what many of us may not know is that this day is celebrated globally as well. Just days after the Sharpeville Massacre, the United Nations expressed its disapproval of the actions of the apartheid state and named the day International Day of Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Well, to hear what our Human Rights Day means to the global community's efforts for human rights, Naledi spoke to Reverend James Woodall, the former president of the National Association for the Advancement of the Colored People in the Georgia state, USA. She started by asking him what their movement was doing in the days and the years that followed after Sharpeville Massacre.
When I think about the history of racial discrimination and the fight against said discrimination, you know, you're exactly spot on. The NAACP was very critical in organizing communities to respond to both violence as well as state-sanctioned discrimination, whether it was segregation, whether it was, boycotting, the ability for people to use public transit, or even educational institutions and preventing people from being able to participate in those educational opportunities. Those are the things that we fought against. And what we saw in response, in retaliation, was violence. We saw police dogs being used, similar to the massacre in the 60s in South Africa and our apartheid even more broadly. We saw the exact same response in states using military, using police, and using law enforcement as a guise to ensure that the population and its citizenry were able to, quote unquote, be kept in line or kept in check. And so since then, we've seen, the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund, which the Legal Defense Fund was, in fact, the legal arm of the NAACP at the time, and they have since separated. But that kind of strategy of one, having the direct action of protest and marching mixed with the corporate kind of engagement so that we can ensure businesses played a part in ensuring discrimination didn't exist. And then the most important part, well, not the most important, but one of the most critical parts was the litigation and challenging and using the court system and the judicial process to really challenge some of these practices. And that was very successful. Even now today, we see, the use of courts in fighting and ensuring the discrimination doesn't exist. And we've seen it in the international context. We see it happening right now in South Africa, has led the nation and led the world in defending against the genocide that's happening in Gaza. And we're seeing it now even here in the United States, where we're seeing those responses to protests, whether it's local issues or even international issues, and seeing again the reverberation, if you will, of using the state and its powers to ensure that there's not a descent to the status quo.
Obviously what I'd want to do for a South African audience is to just, educate South Africans about how in the 60s it was the NAACP alongside organizations with Dr. Martin Luther King that, marched and did a lot of work for civil rights of black people. But today the NAACP is one of the larger voter advocacy groups for black people in the U.S. And I think what's quite ironic is that the U.S. has its election year in 2024. We certainly have our election year in 2024. Just when you speak about human rights, what we're celebrating here on the 21st of March, and how that is a talking point for black Americans in an election year, what does that look like, particularly when you're starting to see polls saying that Trump is actually gaining momentum amongst the black voters?
Well, when I think about what's happening, what we're seeing is really a disintegration of our institutions. And so when people, not just black people, because I think it's across the board, but particularly in the black context, we're watching these institutions that, in the 60s and 70s, we depended on. We needed the courts to protect us. We needed law enforcement responding to our beckoning call when we were, in danger. We were in trouble. And we're watching those systems that we've become in previous generations accustomed to depending on fail. And so when we were marching and we were protesting, we were suing, we were singing about, the vote and Black power and those movements, we were in need of a system to protect us. Now what we're watching and witnessing is those same systems failing, not just for us, but for everybody. And it is almost as if democracy is now in dark. When you have a leading candidate for the president of the United States who has been president before saying, hey, if I lose, there will be a bloodbath, right? That is some of the rhetoric that's being used, and whether or not he actually meant violence or not is beyond the question, because we've seen January 6th where there was violence and people literally lost their life. And we've seen people convicted in federal court here in the States of essentially treason. And so when we think about where we are and why these systems are not working, that is why we're starting to see a kind of pushback from just the general status of I want, politics as usual, and why people are starting to assemble in Trump's favor in some respect, or not just vote at all because of, again, what's happening on the international scene with, what's happening in Israel and Gaza. That has been a number one issue, unfortunately, for African Americans. A lot of people are saying, why are we sending, billions of dollars across the waters when we have issues here that need to be addressed and we are not doing anything about? And so when we see that engagement or lack thereof, it is a direct consequence, again, to those systems that we fought so hard to maintain now fail.
It's interesting. It's hard for me not to make the comparison, right, of a former president of the USA now doing incredibly well in the polls, that he might very well make it back into the White House, when here in South Africa we have a former president who himself is back on the campaign trail, a former president, Jacob Zuma, who his party members have promised a bloodbath if his party is not on the ballot paper. But that's another story for another day. But let's talk a little bit about what this election means for Black people in the U.S. The New York Times has quoted Trump as saying, and listen to this, Black people are like him because he too has been charged by the criminal justice system. I mean, I see your reaction. What do you think of a president who feels that he's a president in waiting again, using those words?
Yeah, and what I say to that is I don't see the distinction, or rather the comparison of Trump being synonymous with African Americans who have been victimized by this criminal legal system. And to that, I would say he is not like, Black people. In fact, in the state and where I live here in the United States, he's currently on trial for election interference. And there's a district attorney, a Black woman by the name of Fani Willis, who is prosecuting that case. And literally, when he turned himself in, he walked out of the back door within 10 minutes. That doesn't happen in ordinary, average American citizen cases. Secondly, the same jail that he was arrested and booked and released from, hundreds of thousands of Black people are still languishing right now without indictments, without bonds, or some with bonds, and are simply there because they cannot afford to get released. And then we have people who are literally dying, right? And so he is not being treated like any Black ordinary citizen. And so that comparison falls short. But what I would say is that what we're seeing is there's been an awakening of again, using the institutions that we've become so dependent on, now turning the wheel on the other side. Meaning, we've seen Black women take roles, at record rates that reflect the diversity of this country. And we celebrate that. We have a Black woman on the United States Supreme Court. We have Black women on state Supreme Courts. We have Black women, in offices, and one ran for governor, and Stacey Abrams. And we have all of these successes, but somehow in this exact same moment, we have these systems failing. And that's something that I think Black people are really starting to look at in a very real way, because what does that mean for us? When we become, the bearers of the system, now it becomes, it starts to disintegrate to the point where it's useless, right? It is dangerous. It is almost creating a schism, if you will, that would allow for the country to fail altogether. And so when we think about like the United States as a project, that project is currently at a D or an F. Because again, those systems that were created to protect the people are not protecting them at all. In fact, it's been that way for quite some time. And so I think in this election, what we'll witness when the returns come back, are people are just downright frustrated. They're pissed off at how this process has played out for generations. And it has come to a head that really doesn't allow for us to have much flexibility in terms of actually seeing policy, outcomes that reflect the will of the people. And that's what democracy is about. But unfortunately, that's not where we are.
I'm going to ask you one final question, Reverend Woodall. We celebrate Human Rights Day. I say this again here in South Africa. Where, obviously, throughout the day, we're going to be having a discussion around where we sit on the state of human rights for the most vulnerable in South Africa. What is your, I suppose, rating of where civil rights are sitting at the moment in the U.S. in the run-up to these elections for Black people, considering that this day, Human Rights Day in South Africa, has essentially sparked the UN's declared International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination?
I would give us an F. And I would give us an F because we watched, again, as South Africa led the world in responding to the today's genocide, right? We saw how South Africa brilliantly and courageously defended people, right? When we talk about human rights and civil rights, the needs for everyday people to have right to life and right to sovereignty. And America, on the other hand, did nothing. And well, actually, I take it back. We did something. We stood in direct opposition to that stance. We stood in direct opposition in a way that literally funded what South Africa petitioned against. And we are watching right now, when we talked about the election, and how President Biden has now suddenly come around because he's seen the impact of those policy decisions. And so I give us an F not just because of that, though. I give us an F because I'm watching in real time on a local level how Black people are being treated in terms of housing discrimination and how these corporations are literally buying out grandma's home, as I like to put it, in terms of kicking our community, our people out of their homes in our communities. I'm watching how schools are being underfunded at drastic and generational rates to ensure that our population remains ignorant and illiterate, which bodes dangerous for the next few generations. I'm watching how environmental issues like navigable waterways and food insecurity is being exacerbated by policies that continue to be perpetrated year in and year out. I'm watching how mandatory minimums in the criminal legal system is literally being weaponized against immigrants, right? Against, not just immigrants from Mexico, right? Immigrants from the motherland as well. And so we're watching all of these kind of human rights violations take place, and we've seen the United Nations come in. We've had conversations with the Embler, and then we've talked about these issues. And unfortunately, the United Nations has more interest in some of these issues than our own government does. And so, unfortunately, the United States is not a beacon of hope and light in terms of ending racial discrimination, because I would argue that we're the number one perpetrator of it. And so I encourage those viewers who are watching to continue to persist and be courageous in their pursuit, because we're going to be doing the same thing. It is not an easy road. It is difficult. It is challenging. I remember Tessa Dooms actually came here a few weeks ago, and she was very vigilant in ensuring that message got through to us, to ensure that we knew that there was a community of believers out there, of freedom fighters who believe that regardless of the political boundary, that we could see freedom in this lifetime. We could see justice. We could see liberation in this lifetime. And so that is what I am encouraged by and I'm hopeful for in this moment, despite all of the things that we've discussed thus far.
Reverend James Woodall, always a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for your time. Please do continue the good work that you're doing.